And Larry goes through every one of those political forms when he lets
Oh,
it.
yeah.
No, we're going to check, and we expect you to check and be sure that there is a political file and that they're all there. You'd have no way of knowing really who did what. But trust me, if somebody complains, it's usually going to be from not the national races or the state races. It's going to be the local races. It's going to be sheriff, county council,
Yeah.
school board. Those are the ones that are going to go off the deep end. And they are the ones that will give you more headaches than anything else. Yeah, go ahead.
I kind of lost track. So on saying mirroring them in real life and on the thing, so that has to start at what point?
March 1.
March 1. Okay.
March 1. This year,
Okay.
2018.
Can you? I guess you can elect to push all that stuff up in retro, but it would have to go back how far?
Yeah, you could. I
You
think
could,
they did say
yeah,
you
you
could if
could.
you
It
wanted to.
goes
They
back-
just said to save you work,
Yeah.
just put going forward. If you went
Yeah.
online today, everything going forward you would put online, but you have to keep the old back to 2012, which was the
12,
last
yeah.
renewal time.
Okay,
Yeah.
last renewal.
Yeah.
Okay.
We really need to familiarize ourselves with the local elections when people are running, when their voting is gonna take place, so that we know when we're there to ask for paper files of local elections.
Well, you
That
would,
might not be right.
yeah, you could, yeah, you just want to be sure that they're doing that. I mean, you have no way as an inspector of knowing who's running what, but you want to be sure that they have an accurate local file there. I mean, I run into a lot of stations that don't get any political advertising. I mean, they just, you know, politics has changed a lot, but like, for example, you're talking about going back and putting up some of the past files. My gosh, during the presidential election, and you know, with Senate and Congress and everything all about the same time, you know, you'd have tremendous files to have to upload, and that would take a lot of man hours. But you just want to be sure that they're keeping those political files in paper form, or it could be locally electronic. Since they're scanning them online anyway to go to the commission site, they could keep a special folder on a computer that they know is safe and secure and make it available. That's all they're doing that for.
And do you organize them by race, like?
Oh yeah, let's see, I don't know if it'll show here.
He did
Yeah,
say-
there you go.
Yeah.
So you've got federal, local, non-candidate. Now this is important, non-candidate issue ads.
I didn't know about that. till this came
That's a
out.
hot topic. Now, I can't say for Alabama, but let's say South Carolina right now. We had a debacle with our big nuclear plant that bellied up after God knows how many billions of dollars, and Dominion Energy out of Virginia is coming in and wants to buy our power company and give everybody $1,000 back and reduce our rates and all this kind of stuff. And they're spending a fortune on ads. Well, that's non-candidate issue ads, and that has to go in that file. So you might have something very similar here where maybe they're going to, you're going to build a large gambling casino in downtown Birmingham, for example, and that could be a non-issue ad depending on how it's presented and the controversy behind. But as you see, it's state, non-candidate, local, and federal, and then it breaks down even more. You know, you can break it down by race, by individual. Let's see, I don't know if they have president, U.S. House, U.S. Senate. So, I mean, you can see how they have it broken down already.
For John and I and other inspectors, the importance is not so much the content, but the stuff that's in there.
That's
They are
right.
putting stuff in there.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to look at dates on EEOs and ownership, but when it comes to a lot of political, you have no way of knowing. Now, we're going to move into any questions before we move on? I'm going to try to wrap this up in a little bit because I know some of y'all probably want to take a break. Now, this is the fun one. We've got citizens agreements. Anybody in the room know what a citizens agreement is?
With like a local club or league of businesses or something like that?
You're close.
Yeah.
This really goes back to,
The Civil War.
yeah, that's about the truth. But in the 60s and early 70s, there was a lot of push for stations to put diverse programming on. And when there was controversy, owner says, it's my radio station, I don't have to do this, blah, blah, blah. Local groups would get together and we want you to put on programming for this particular minority group or this particular issue oriented. So they would do agreements and they would say, okay, we will carry X number of hours of programming for this particular issue or this particular group, and you won't file against our license. Because what was happening in those days, a lot of people were filing against station licenses. And so that was where most of these came into. That's what was called citizens agreements. You agreed with the citizenry to run specific type of programming to meet their needs, and that's how that was dealt with. It was more common probably in small communities where there wasn't a lot of diversity or than it probably was in large cities. I don't think I have seen one of those. I don't think I've ever seen one. I mean, I know they existed from the history and being in broadcasting. I shouldn't date us, but Frank and Larry and I, probably remember a few of those because we've been around so long. But anyway, it's an oddball thing, but it still could occur and you still could run into it.
A former Atlanta chief up there, Fred Broche, told me when I asked him one day, I said, what the heck is a citizens agreement? I've never seen one in a folder. He said, well, let me give you a scenario. Maybe license renewal is coming up and a group of Alaskan Indians come in and they say, you're not doing any programming for our Alaskan Indian organization, and as a result, we're going to file a petition to deny your renewal, and we're going to apply for it. So you hammer out an agreement. Okay, on Saturday morning, we'll do 30 minutes or an hour programming dedicated to the Alaskan Indian.
Exactly.
That is a citizens agreement, but
yep.
you don't see them anymore.
No, you really don't. Now, with the public file online now, we have never been through a renewal that the public files were available to everyone in the country.
Right.
So in the 60s and 70s, where license challenges were fairly common, there would be groups from across the country that might be challenging a number of licenses across the U.S. I think women's groups did that for a while. There were certain women's organizations, there were some minority groups, and so when that happened, they challenged, hundreds of stations. Well, what happens when you get a challenge on your license, it moves to the back of the line and it sits there until the commission gets around and has time to deal with it. So you may see a lot of this in the future, or either people challenging you for not doing your documents properly or not having proper information in the files. We don't know what you're going to be facing. So that's something you want to keep in mind. Donor groups. Now, this is something that is specific to non-commercial radio stations, though I'm sure there are a few commercial stations that would love to have donors. And I'll show you, let's see here. Here is the donor list. And let's look at 2018. Okay, June. There is a list of donors and entities who made donations to WBHM. Well, wait a minute. WBHM, that's University of Alabama, Birmingham?
Uh-huh.
And Auburn made a donation. I just noticed that. Isn't that amazing?
See, they're happy. They get along.
Yeah.
So, that was anyway, so they wouldn't beat them this year. They donated to them.
So anyway, that's something when you go to look at a non-commercial station, you can look for the donor list because that's required to be in there.
Wow.
And so no amounts, no other information other than what you see here, date and the name of the company.
Remember that donors is not somebody that sends you $5 or $10.
No.
It's someone or some entity that actually underwrites a specific program.
Yeah. If you do a fundraising like religious stations may do what they call share-a-thons, where they're raising funds. And people will send in, they're going to pledge $20 a month, $30 a month, or something like that. that's not considered donor.
EMF's list would be about, probably 250 million people on it.
Yeah,
Right,
exactly. But if it's University of Alabama, let's say, and they'd donate $10,000 to have the University of Alabama studio, and it's a one-time donation, that goes on the donor list. That's the kind of thing they're
Or
talking about.
if it's a specific program, like
Yeah.
in the case on a Christian station, if somebody wants to underwrite David Jeremiah's program,
Yeah.
and you run and you say this program is underwritten by so-and-so and so-and-so, that goes under the donor list.
Same thing with public radio, you know, all things considered, you know, underwritten by blah, 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 blah. So that's where that is. Somebody had a question. Oh, okay.
I noticed they're doing one every month, but the commission doesn't give an interval that they have to be submitted. What do y'all look for?
I just look to see that there is a list in there and that it's a current list. It could be done depending on the station and how often they do it. It could be yearly. It could be monthly. I mean, you know, a lot of public stations, for example, they do, instead of doing major fundraisers, you know, twice a year, they've kind of gotten away from that where they're doing ongoing fundraising, and they have full-time departments that do that. So you have to, it's much more simplistic for them to do it that way. You just want to be sure that it's current.
So,
Yes.
Odd example of a commercial license. We have a customer, it's a religious group that has commercial licenses. And they do, like, what they call, like, fundraisers that
Yeah.
are specific. The fact that the license is commercial, is that the delineation, like?
Well, now, if it's a commercial license, are they operating in a non-commercial mode? Because that's the way.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, in that case, then they come under those. They come under this rule.
So you would still
Yes.
do that?
Yes, definitely. Now, I have seen some cases of where non-commercial stations have commercial licenses or own a commercial license, and they have programs that are underwritten. And I have seen cases where they would say, this program is underwritten by such and such, and what had happened when you look into it was the organization who runs the fundraiser, the non-commercial owned, buys that time as a purchase and not a donation, and that's how they did that. So that gets into internal revenue, and I don't want to deal with those kind of issues, and they get a little screwy. But yeah, but normally non-commercial, non-profit organizations that own stations in the commercial band are operated non-commercially, and they have notified the commission that they were operating the station as non-commercial. But that does mean at some point in time, if they ever sold it, it could go back to being a commercial station. That's the difference there. But they would come under, I would still look for donor lists there. Okay, any other questions?
So commercial stations can do fundraising or operate under.
I have seen it happen.
But you can't do vice versa.
I have seen it happen where the commercial station had a nonprofit arm,
Right.
supposedly independent organization with separate board, and they purchased the time on the station, and that's how they did that. Now, how legal that is, I don't know, but at the time it was. Rules change over the years. I'm not an attorney, so not going to get into that one. But there are always ways around everything. Now, let's see. We got past the donors list. Oh, FCC Investigations of complaints. That means most of the time you see this is on television side. You know, the famous Janis Jackson, Justin Timberlake scene was up there. I see a lot of Fox stations that I inspect. You know, a lot of people don't like The Simpsons for some reason. I haven't figured that one out yet, and they'll file a complaint. But anytime there's a complaint filed, and if they file it against the network and you aired the network program, more than likely you're going to get a copy of a letter, and it's going to affect every network affiliate, and it stays in your file until the commission makes a ruling that they threw it out or there is some form of action. And it will reside there in the investigation or complaints. And that might mean specific programming, that might mean EEO issues, whatever the FCC is investigating. Now, Again, the only way you're going to know that is you open the file and there's something in there. You can certainly ask the station, you know, are there any investigations or complaints about you or anything like that? But you don't see a lot of those. Those are kind of few and far between. Third party fundraising, this is now for non-commercial stations. This is, I haven't run into one of those, have you, Larry?
No.
This is where they would allow a non-com station to go in and have a fundraiser, so like for hurricane victims of Haiti, for example, and they're doing that for another nonprofit organization. Yes, sir.
Back a number of years ago, I inspected one station that, I think it was about 6 years after the Janet Jackson incident. They still didn't have their license renewal done because they were waiting on the final determination
Yes.
of that case.
Yes, and that's fairly common. There was a period of time before TV went online, and I know Larry's run into it, and I have too, where the affiliates had 2 license renewal terms that they didn't have license, and the public file took up file cabinets because the commission had not ruled. But the commission pretty much cleared up all those issues very recently and took care of that. But that was a real problem. And occasionally you might run into that where license renewal, they just haven't been granted a license. And as long as the commission hasn't ruled on any action against the station, they could go however long they want. And then when they make the ruling, and we'll get into that in a minute about the files, then that's when everything would start. Again, non-commercial stations, this is like if you're doing a fundraiser for another organization, not your station. And there is a document that would go into the file. I'm going to skip ahead just a quick second. Joint sales agreements, local public notice announcement. Joint sales agreements are when 2 TV stations come together and one sales department's going to sell for both of them. They are separate ownership. You see that in some cases, not as much now as you used to a few years ago. Time brokerage agreements. Now this is a good one here, and we probably should see more of it. And there's some really quirky things that could pop up. Let's say a local sports team comes to you and they want you to carry their games, but you don't want to carry the game, so they say, okay, I'll buy the time from you. So they're going to buy the time from you, but they retain the right to run the commercials and sell the commercials in that. That's a time brokerage agreement. So you need to have a document in that folder saying, you know, what the terms and all this, you don't give the monies or anything like that, but the basic terms, because that's a time brokerage agreement. Same thing, we used to do big business when I had a radio station on funeral homes on Sunday morning. And what they would do is they'd buy a 2 or 3 hour block a Sunday, and they would go out and sell local commercials. Local groups would come in and they would sing, and I'd get a flat check every week. I got my money. They'd go out and sell theirs for whatever they could. That's a time brokerage agreement. So anything that you sell a block of time where the person buying that time sells the commercials, pays for that time, and deals with the programming is a time brokerage agreement. Whereas joint sales agreement, that's between 2 non-commonly owned entities, radio, TV, or whatever, where one sales department is selling for both of them. Political matters, controversial issues, disclosures, that again has to deal with controversial issues very similar to what we see in the other political. They kind of overlap a little bit. And local public notice announcements, the only time you see that's license renewal time. Those go in there when you're running the notice that you're filing your license and when you run the notice that you have filed your license. And once the license has been granted, those can be deleted and go away. Any questions before we jump up to issues and programs? Oh, I must be getting mail. Sorry about that.
I can be the one asking all these questions, but how does that, what's the delineation between time brokerage and things like syndicated programming where they, or like an info commercial that just happens to be like a commercial that airs for an hour? Well,
in those particular programs, on a syndicated programming, they're providing the programming, you're still able to sell time and run commercials inside the programming, and they're getting barter. So that's a little different there. Your other program, again, you can run commercials at some point, but they're buying some time, but it's the whole block right there. It's technically, that's not, it's more of a long form commercial than anything else. It's close to time brokerage, but not really. Yeah, go ahead, Frank.
I guess the difference would be like, we run Auburn sports.
Yeah,
Auburn runs some spots, we run some spots.
Right.
We sell it. We also run UAB sports. UAB buys the time, sells all the spots.
and
Understood?
UAB would be time brokerage and Auburn is not. That's right.
And I think what, probably, Larry, that would be a good class that, for ABA to take up, for radio managers and sales managers on all this, because you go to them right now and say, we need an agreement. Oh, you don't need that.
Yeah.
I've been having a real heck of a time with them on political, getting them to turn
If
over
they,
the paperwork.
if they
Yeah.
buy the time, they sell the commercials and retain the money from those commercials.
Yes.
I mean, the station
Yeah.
doesn't get it. They just pay a flat fee for the time, and that's the time brokerage agreement.
Yeah.
Got it.
And
Thank you.
the infomercials, at least when I was in radio on the air, they used to be a barter system where they would ask the radio station you heard it on, and we would get a kickback
Right.
from everything that anybody bought off our.
And in most cases, that's the way that works. They're running that, and you're getting a percentage or some predetermined amount of money that's coming back to you. But
Right.
see, they're not really controlling programming. They're not going out and selling spots to other people. They're just promoting their product.
I
But
think they
that's-
call those PIs,
Yeah.
per
Right.
inquiry.
Yeah.
You get, every time they get an inquiry that came from your station, you get paid.
That's
a
right.
That's the
percentage.
stuff you use to fill your overnight time slots.
Yeah.
Right, right.
Yeah. Or at 12:30 to 1 o'clock right after the noon news.
Yeah.
But anyway, but again, time brokerage, that's the one thing, and Frank did a good explanation of that. Auburn, in some cases too, with like, I don't know about Auburn and some of the other colleges, you have to pay for some of this stuff now, for the,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But if they're buying the time and they're retaining the rights to all the commercial breaks and they're going out and selling those commercials, doesn't matter if you're running them or not, for them, they're retaining all that fund and they're paying you a flat fee. That's a time brokerage agreement. There has to be an agreement there. And a lot of people get tripped up by that. And especially small markets, because you see a lot of that in small markets where, again, they sell to funeral homes or organizations or groups and they buy the time and then sell the spots themselves. Any other questions before we get into our fun and games of issues and programs list? Okay. Issues and programs list. Okay, I like this. See, he's got, 2011, 2012, 13, 14, 15, all the way down. Oh, look, he's even prepared for 2019.
I know it.
Did they make them up ahead of time? Should we look?
Yeah.
But this is one that we all deal with, and when it's organized like this, it's wonderful. If it's not organized, I'm going to ask the person, it would really be nice, let me show you another website, and you see how this is organized. It would help you, it would help me, and it might help the FCC if they're looking at your files. Because when we go in there and it's no folders or anything like that, then I'm trying to look to see that there's Q1, 2, 3, 4 for 2012, Q1, 2, 3, 4 for 2013, and on down the line. Easy for me to make a mistake and overlook something. Well, if I can do that, Larry can do that, the commission can do it, and you might get an inquiry even though you didn't mean to have an inquiry. Now, the other nice thing, you can see already they're current. They've got 4, 4, 4, and all the way down here, this year there's 2. So you know that they have put some kind of documents in there already. So that's a good thing. So let's go to 2014. And they have everything again. They've used a naming, same naming throughout the whole thing. Of course, this one was slightly different here at the top than the other ones, and that's why it popped up that way. But again, you've got all of them in the same order, so that it's easy to read. Now, let's look at quarterly issues and programs. Now, the commission says you have to have issues, you have to have programs, and you have to show how the programs relate to the issues. And that's what we look for. We want to be sure that there are documents in there. Are we going to scrutinize the document and advise the station? What are y'all going to do? What do you do in the past? Do you just look for the document? Or see, everybody knows I'm setting them up. This is what we look for and see that it's there. Now, if as an inspector you get there and say, well, you know, you didn't do enough here and you didn't do enough there and I didn't like the way you did this, now you have become an attorney and giving advice. Remember our deal between engineering and attorneys, they don't do engineering, we don't do legal advice, so just keep that in mind. But you can advise. Now, they've got issues, arts, economy, education, government, science and technology. Oh, they had science and technology twice? No. Yes, and. So, now, they have issues. So, maybe they don't have issues, but they had the issues listed. Now we look, and here are highlights from issues in sustainable development, your experience with Alabama's prison. I mean, they are starting to list stuff here, and this is what they're supposed to be doing. Now, everybody's form is going to be somewhat different. You may go to, they've got 11 pages, so there's arts, okay? There's economy. There's education. Did Daryl set me up on this and have all this set up this way? Did a good job. But
By the way, Daryl's, I told him you used an example.
Yeah, yeah.
He's having a laugh at this.
oh, is he? Tell him we're going to send him a fine in a minute.
He's at the beach, so he doesn't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. But anyway, you see what they've done, and this really is the way it should be done. It's got the date, it's got times, it's got information in there, who was interviewed, the program, everything. That's what the commission wants. Now, you're going to go into some stations, and they're going to have 4 or 5 lists, and they might have 1 page. And on such and such date, we did this, 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 and this. I can't tell you that's right or wrong. Only their communications attorney can advise them. But if they've got the issues, they've got some form that they've done programming, they technically have met the letter of the law.
The way that I explain it to managers and operators, I say, you know, when you get a license to operate a radio station, and managers don't like to hear this, but I say when you get a license to operate a radio station, contrary to popular belief, it's not to make money. It's to serve the public interest if you read the rules. Well, the only way they know that you're serving the public interest is you should go out and determine what the issues are in the community. They could be overcrowded schools, bad roads, drug problems, whatever it happens to be. Then you come back and do some sort of programming to address those issues and then document it.
Yeah.
And that's what it is.
The biggest problem we've run into, radio and television does a much better job of this than radio. That's because they have vast news departments and they can assign somebody to do that. You know, Frank works for a big operation. They have one person that just does nothing but sit in the corner and do issues and programs. I'm just yanking his chain. Frank, you probably end up doing it, don't you?
No, I have to fight with the news people.
Oh, okay. Well, see, you have news people. Most people don't have news people anymore. But I tell a lot of stations when they get to this report that at license renewal time, and I know most of y'all don't remember this, but again, there are 3 or 4 of us that do. When you filed a license renewal, it was a box that was about this thick. You had to send samples of your newscast. I mean, God forbid, I don't know what the commission did with all that stuff, but they could have built a building out of paper with what just went in. But I tell them, pretend you're up for license renewal. You're in a courtroom with the administrative law judge, and your public file is sitting in the witness box.
Right.
You're sitting with your communications attorney, and the FCC counsel's over here at the other table, and you're gagged. You can't say a word. Everything comes off that box. And in that box is your issues and programs. Now, would you rather see an 11-page report up there where they detailed it like this, or would you want the judge to look at a one-page report that had 4 or 5 things on it and that was it? Now, both of them probably met the letter of the law, maybe not the total intent, but what's the judge going to say? So when you put it in terms like that, it kind of helps people understand how critical that is. Now, you're going to run into stations that they don't care. You know, you wonder why on earth did I even come to inspect? I did one a couple of weeks ago that they didn't have a public file. They didn't. They had turned it on, but they didn't have any documents in the public file. They didn't have quarterly issues and programs. Now, they did a talk show every morning for an hour. There's your stuff, but they never documented it. So those are the kind of things you have to run into. Question?
Yeah, so you mentioned that there's a multiplicity of forms. You know, you might run into just about anything in terms of the format that
Right.
the thing carries. But there is the rule that the listings have to contain 5 required elements.
That's correct.
Date, time, duration.
That is correct.
And what I have run into not infrequently is a station, well, they'll have everything except for the time or
Right.
what have you. How much of a stickler are you guys for making them go back and correct such things or you know, that sort of thing?
In those cases, and Larry and I may operate differently, in those cases I will say the rules state these items. We just want you to be aware of it so that forthgoing you could make those corrections and changes.
What were those items? Narrative, date, time, duration.
Yeah. It's in the self-inspection report, the full report, and it's also in the rules. The problem you run into, their intent was good, and I couldn't say that an FCC inspector wouldn't walk in there and look at it and see the documents and move on. I don't know. But I think our job is to educate people, and we want them to understand what they have to have. I'll take handouts with me, and I know Larry does, that explains and breaks out all the documents in the public file, how long they need to be there, what has to be with each one of those documents. And I give them that as a leave behind. I also do the same thing with chief operator and stuff like that, and we'll get into more of that later. But that's what you have to do. You have to educate them. I don't think you can fail them because their intent was good and they were trying, but at least educate them so that they do it right from that point on. That's the thing we're looking at.
What do you do when you get there and all they have is PSAs?
I've run into that.
I have. Well, you speak on that one. I'll say what I do.
Well, I went to one station and I looked in the public file, and under the issues and programs, they just had a list of 60 and 30-second PSAs. And I said, don't you do any programming to address the issues? They said, no, we're automated all day long. We don't even have a microphone. We just run satellite all the time. We don't have any way to do it. I said, oh, really? And talking to the commission, they tell me is that PSAs count, but you cannot use them entirely. The reason being is you could sit there and run PSAs for the Red Cross all day long, but it doesn't show that you as a licensee has taken the initiative to see what the issues are in your community and come back and address them. So, yeah, you can include PSAs if you like, but you just can't use them by themselves.
Did you flunk them?
Huh?
Did you give them a certificate?
No.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
And that would be the same
I
thing.
do either.
I wouldn't have either. And I've run into that because it's not acceptable. But that's just something you have to watch out for.
And I flunked people that do news stories that have nothing to do with their community.
Yeah. Well, news, you know,
Absolutely nothing to
and
do
it's
with
a
the
real
community.
problem out
Learn
there.
about issues.
Yeah, it's a real problem out there. But now, here's a gotcha on it. Okay, so if you walked in and one of their issues was international politics, for example, maybe that was important for where they're located, and their news stories,
That would be fine.
yeah, that's
But
when
a
it
guy
would be.
getting killed on a motorcycle crash,
Yeah,
unless they tied it into.
to safety or traffic or
Right.
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. All right, any other questions? Paul, did, you have a question about that a minute ago and I forgot to ask.
No, I guess if you had answered before,
Oh,
if there's-
okay.
if they have a current one and there's buzzards and tumbleweeds before, nothing in there, but if there's just a current quarterly, what do?
I can't pass them. Now, I'm going to ask them to go and document what they've done in the past, and they're going to have to recreate something, and then they'll have documents in there, but then they're going to have to post it online, and it's going to show that it was late. But at the same time, I'm going to tell them to contact their counsel and do whatever their counsel advises, but I can't pass them. Yeah, I can't pass them. Yeah.
There is a situation, if during the license period, the 8-year term of the license period, if your station, you sell or you bought a station mid-term of that, and the previous owner did not have this information, didn't keep it, and you bought it, you're not liable for what took place from the previous owner.
Yeah, clock
So you-
starts ticking with the new ownership.
Right.
Yeah, because I did a due diligence. I was telling Larry about this, and I walked in and walked to the transmitter site, and I asked the owner where the maintenance logs were. And he said, oh, they're in the clipboard there on the rack. And I walked over and looked at the first page, and sure enough, there was today's date and, you know, some parameters and everything. I turned the second page, and it was about 3 or 4 years ago. And then I asked him, he was bragging about his new tower light indicator on the side of the building, and I said, well, how do you do your tower lights? Oh, I check them every day. Okay. How's your remote control? Well, it works sometime. I said, well, have you done your quarterly tower light inspection? I didn't see them in the maintenance report. Oh, we don't do that. We don't need to do that. They're working. So I go over to the station, and looking at the station, to say the least, it was pretty bad. And I asked the guy, I said, I noticed you weren't online with your public file. Where's your paper public file? Well, we had a trailer out back here with some equipment. Our files were in there, and it was stolen, and they took our files. And I said, well, what about your station log, which we'll talk about later, and you all know the station log with EAS and everything. Well, they stole those too. And all I could do is advise the potential owner is, I hope that through the process of transferring ownership that the commission doesn't come down on them, because there are going to be fines that are going to be levied before they will give approval for that station's transfer. So that could be another whole set of issues, but those are some of the things you run into. Any other questions on issues and programs?
That's a biggie with the commission too. They really come down, and there's some pretty hefty fines.
Big time.
Even if you've just missed 2 or 3 quarters. There's some heavy fines.
Give you a good example. I was part of 3 stations. Well, this makes me feel great. Even I was chief operator for the 3. They each got fined $9,000 for quarterly issues and programs because they would not do the document. And that's a situation I'm sure we've all been in. We try to get management to do everything, and they just don't care. And I had one of the cases lasted for 9 years. Now, we all know about statute of limitations. We were honest. We checked the box saying, look, we missed 3 quarterly issues and programs. We're sorry. We don't know what happened. They got missed. Fine originally was $14,000. They wrote to the commission and said, would you reconsider? The commission came back and said, okay, we'll reconsider, and then we didn't hear a word. Under advice of counsel, it's don't bother them. And you can look in places and watch status of documentations, and it vanished for a while. This is no joke. It went away. No trace or file or anything. And 2 months, now we're into license renewal for the 8-year period. This was the previous period. Statute of limitations is up. 2 weeks before license renewal filing, they get a notice, $9,000. So I called legal counsel, we talked, we decided it would be better to pay the fine. So we paid the fine, we got our license, life was good. So Peter Doyle, who was over the FCC Broadcast Bureau at the time, really nice guy, but ruled with an iron hand if any of you ever dealt with him. I was in Washington about 3 months later, and we were having lunch together at a conference. And I looked at Peter and I said, I've got to ask you a question. Now that this has all been handled, here is such and such with station so and oh yeah, I remember that one. I said, statute of limitations were up. He said, yep. I said, so why? He said, because we could. I said, come on, Peter. I mean, it's really nice. He was half laughing. He said, look, we reduced it to $9,000. It probably cost you $15,000 in legal counsel and back and forth to the commission, so you got a bargain. So keep that in mind. They take this stuff seriously. The other two stations that were 9 each, they would not allow the sale to transfer, the properties to transfer until the fines were paid. So they do take public file. Now, we talked briefly about uploads. You can go in and everybody can look. Let's see. Well, my God. Oh, well, here's earlier this. Oh, older. We'll go older here. All right. Here's all the stuff that's been uploaded by the radio station. And you can do the same thing on the website, but there's all the donor list. You know, here's the underwriting, when it was done, all the information you want to know. So all that's available to the general public out there for every file that you put up. And if you go back to the main page, it'll list what stations are filing that day and dates, times, and everything. So it's all available out there on the FCC site.
There's been some worry by some people, you know, when they went online that there would be a lot of cottage industries popping up around the country where people sit at home in their PJs just scrolling through this and finding things. You know, there's people that love to do that and cause problems. So,
and now here, as I mentioned before, recent station history, there's PFT uploaded, cable entry, whatever cable company it was, AM, KTSE, some other cable entries, all that's up there. Because by the way, cable systems have to go through the same thing as radio and television does.
hopefully.
Yeah. So any questions on the public file? I know that was a lot to go through. We've got a couple other documents that really start to lean on the technical side. We want to take a break first before. Okay.
Yeah, we can switch over to our.
Yeah, let me go back. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, these are some documents that typically are not part of the public file, but it is documents that you're supposed to have. AM stations, annually, every station has to do a NRSC, National, I forgot what it stood for, Radio Commission. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what that is you have to have somebody come in with the appropriate equipment and measure your station's modulation to make sure you're not splattering and being not a good neighbor to the people above you and below you. And there's a specific mask that we'll show you later this afternoon that your signal has to sit in. And this has to be done each year, I think within a 14-month period. Is that
Correct.
What it is, Frank?
Yeah, 14 months.
And you have to retain those for 2 years, the last 2 years of NRSC measurements. So you have to have those on there. The station log, which we'll talk about this afternoon, is where you keep the information about EAS, about tower lights, about transmission system maintenance. Years ago, we used to have transmitter logs where you made meter readings and stuff about the transmitter. The commission sort of had a lot of throwing away of paper logs, and also they sort of did away with that. Now, I don't know how John is, but when I go in and I see a station still keeping a transmitter log, I don't tell them to quit, because from a technical standpoint, you guys know that's good to keep a watch on your transmitter. It's just that the commission doesn't require you to keep that log like you used to have to keep it, but they replaced it with a station log that you do have to keep, and we'll go through that in detail. And the antenna structure registration, which is typically not in the public file, but you have to maintain that as well, because that's, before you can erect a tower, you have to file with the FAA, tell them where it's going to be and how tall it's going to be, and they have to give you approval to build it. You can't just go out and build a tower.
One other gotcha on the antenna structure registration, when you go out and look at the form, confirm that it's to the proper licensee.
Yeah.
There have been fines handed out to stations, and this is an easy thing to happen. The communications attorney does all the paperwork, they do all the transferring and everything, and all the filing is done, and they always seem to forget, because it's not part of the normal package, of transferring the license, or the ownership records of the antenna structure. It's a very easy thing to do, but it is a gotcha, because the commission wants to know who to call when the tower light's not working or when there's a problem. And I think some of this goes back to the fact that there's so many towers are owned by several large companies that they just assume it stays with that ownership no matter what. So do look at that when you go, to be sure that the structure registration is there and it is the proper ownership.
There was a situation out in the Midwest a couple of years ago where the commission received a complaint on a tower that I think the tower lights had been off for a good while, so they looked on the ASR, saw who the owner was and where the address was, and went out to this house, and there was an old farmer and his wife living in this out on a farm, and they introduced themselves, who they were, and said, "We want to talk to you about your tower." And they said, "We don't have a tower." I said, "We don't own a tower." And then they said, "Oh, well, now we used to have one back when we used to own that little radio station." And the FCC guy said, "Well, when did you sell the station?" "Oh, about 10 years ago or so." Well, nobody remembered to change the ownership, so their name was still on it. I think they worked out a deal where they didn't have to pay
They become responsible, and in any tower situation, if the owner of the tower is not performing his due diligence and maintaining the tower properly with lighting, monitoring, and painting if it's necessary to be painted, and the commission cannot get satisfaction from the owner, guess who they go to next? Yes. Yep. So it could be you.
They changed that rule in 2014.
No, they will still go after you.
If you're a renter on a tower,
Yep.
and they can't get,
I know I recommend to all the stations that I inspect.
Yeah.
Everybody's gonna be liable if anything happens anyway, but
right.
Yeah.
I know in 2014, they changed the rule to make the responsible the owner.
They did, but at the same time, if they can't get satisfaction of the owner, I mean, we've had it from the horse's mouth. They start down the pecking order.
I actually heard of a tenant that was on a tower that was owned by somebody else, and they had a problem with the tower. He kept after him to fix it, they never would. So he fixed it himself and deducted the cost from his rent. So that got the owner's attention,
Yeah.
you know. So he only paid half his rent that way.
Yeah.
A couple of other things here we'll go that we normally cover, we talked about this, quarterly tower inspection. This is typically tower lights that you're inspecting the tower lights quarterly. The tower light rule is one that says you must observe your tower lights once every 24 hours, either visually or by some electronic means with a remote control or whatever. When you say visually, and I'm sure John has run into this before as well, I've gone to stations where their tower is way out in the middle of nowhere in a wheat field or something, and I say, "How do you check your tower lights?" "Well, Farmer Joe that lives across the street, he calls me if there's a problem." I said, "Yeah, but is he checking them every day?" "Well, he calls me if there's a problem." I said, "Yeah, but you need to have some sort of," and one station I went to actually had that situation, but they had made up a little booklet of little sheets that Farmer Joe can sign every day, and they would pay him, you know, some ridiculous fee, you know, $5 a month or something to do that, and he would just fill out that little thing so you'd have a documentation for it. So you have to check them some way once every 24 hours unless you have installed an automatic monitoring system to your tower lights, which will notify you any time of the day or night that your tower lights has failed. Then you are relieved from checking them every 24 hours. That is actually the better way to do it, because if you're checking them manually, either by remote control or visual, and they fail, and you check them at 9 o'clock, and they fail at 10 o'clock, that night, you won't know about it till 9 o'clock the next night. But if you have an automatic system, if your towers fail at 2 a.m., you're going to get a text or a phone call from the remote control saying, hey, the tower light's wrong.
Yeah.
So that's a better system. But the quarterly tower inspection is to make sure that that system is working. And you typically do that by simulating a tower failure.
Yeah.
Yes.
We had some vendors come into our local.
Is this in related to tower lights?
Right. In other words, basically what they were saying was that they had not changed rules in a long, long time, but they did change one rule with the FAA, and he indicated that every time the light changes status, which means it'll be coming on coming on at night at dusk and then going off in the morning, that you have to have a precise time log when those things take place. I thought, wow, what a bugaboo.
Well, a lot of the,
You tell me anything
yeah,
about it.
there's a lot of confusion in the rules for all of us right now, because there are some rules that state like, oh, you can do away with side markers, for example, because of the bird issue. So if you do that, though, then you come under a whole different set of rules. So people advise don't change anything, otherwise you have to repaint or you have to relamp. And then there's the question that all lights have to burn solid. So anything that you touch with your tower could set off another whole set of rules, so it's become very confusing. Most of the remote control systems, if you have a good remote control system, even if it's an old one, it will tell you if you set it up properly and you're printing out or doing logging, it'll tell you when the lights come on and when the lights go off, even if it's an old system and you're monitoring all the lights. So it's an advisable thing to do. It's a real still gray area, but when you're dealing with a client or you're dealing with an inspection and they have some gray areas like that, advise them carefully that they need to look and deal with their consultant or their attorney and find out what they really need to be doing, because the liability on a tower problem, especially if a plane hits it or something like that, is just immense, because it just ricochets and goes on down the row. The other thing you have to, on the new monitoring systems, and if you change to a different type system monitoring, you have to monitor all the beacons, if it's beacons. So that means side markers are monitored, each bulb is monitored in the array, and so it just depends on when that tower was done, what rules you fall under. So there's a lot of gray and a lot of confusion there. So I think you have to use your own good judgment when you're inspecting them.
If a station gets authorization to turn off side lights, okay, you say that changes fixtures in other areas.
Yeah.
What would that change? What would be different about what they would have to?
It depends on there's a whole different set of rules, and honestly I don't remember how but they change, I think, with heights versus the type of lights that you have on the tower.
It has to be over 350 feet.
Right.
The reason that 350 foot level is above 350 feet, you have to have two levels of blinking lights. Under that, you can just have one.
But it changes, the configuration of the beacons versus side mark. It's really confusing, and a lot of people don't understand it. When we go to inspect, we look at their license where they have the information on the requirements and match that to the tower. If it's strobes, day, night, if it's beacons, and they have LEDs. So that's what we're going by. We're not.
Instructor registration will have the FAA
That's
requirements.
exactly right, and that's what we're looking at. So we're not really getting into an interpretive mode as much as we're verifying what they are supposed to be doing.
So that it matches the license.
Correct.
Whatever the license put on there.
But good points you brought up. But it is really confusing out there. I'll say one funny story. I did an inspection a number of years ago, and tall towers, like 800 and something feet. And I asked the chief operator how he checked the tower lights. And he says, well, I live in the subdivision right by the tower. I just check them visually. Well, it was late in the day, and I said, well, I need to see the logs. He said, well, I have them at the house. I said, that's fine. Bring them in the morning. It's the first time I'd seen about 2 or 3 years worth of logs that were all in the same color, green ink. I guarantee you that night he was doing this number.
That used to happen with the transmitter logs. You look at a transmitter log, and you were reading them. In the old days, you had to check them every 30 minutes or every hour or something. And the plate current and the plate voltage never changed the whole. It was the same thing. So.
And there was a rule against that. That was called repetitious logging, and you had to log with black or blue ink, and it couldn't be repetitious. So you better change those readings each time you wrote them down.
That's right.
So, go ahead, Larry. I'm sorry.
The equipment performance measurements. That's sort of like what we talked about a while ago with the NRSC, but what this is reference to. If you make any change in your transmission system, including the exciter, the serial generator, the transmitter, the antenna, and I suppose the transmission line too, but any of that, you have to do an equipment performance measurement, which means you're actually checking harmonic or spurious radiation to make sure that you're not splattering on somebody else. And you have to make that if you make a change that will affect the transmission system itself, and I think you have to keep those for like 2 years. I normally encourage people to keep them forever because that shows what you've done and how the readings come out. But keep that in mind. If you change antennas, if you change transmitters or exciters or stereo generators.
That means the audio processor.
So you only need to keep the occupied bandwidth for FM for 2 years?
Right.
I've been telling folks to keep it until you replace it.
Yeah, it's okay.
It's okay.
That's a great.
Legally, the commission says if the inspector comes by, you gotta have. If it's after 2 years, he can't fine you because that's what the rule says.
I'm gonna ask for it no matter what.
Yeah.
Just to see if they have it, but I'm not gonna ding somebody unless it was a recent installation.
And how many people actually, if they change processors, go back and check that?
That many?
0.
That's
That's
right.
exactly right.
Well, here's what we do with EMF. We've gone through this, and they actually have a separate form that we will go in and check the pilot frequency and the pilot level injection, and just add that to the EPM.
Yeah.
So, which they said that covers us.
That's fine. That's what they want. They just want you to check it.
Right.
And that's all they're concerned with.
Make sure that
And
pilot's with
here's
you.
another reason why you want that document, especially if you're an FM today. Anybody familiar with 7th Harmonic Distortion? It all deals with cellular. And the companies are getting more and more arrogant every day. I mean, I know it doesn't matter whether it's T-Mobile, AT&T, Verizon. Sprint's about the only one I hadn't run into yet. But they will file against you, and they want you to. Biggest problem that you have in 7th Harmonic Distortion is cabinet radiation. So if you got an old Continental transmitter, you got a problem. If you got an old Gates, you got a problem. The thing you have to deal with is work with these people. But the first thing you need, if you've got that document, and especially if you keep it updated and show that you're within, and every transmitter is within, but they are running their receivers so wide open that the noise floor minus 100 is where most of this is existing.
I've got them, they've told me, well, you need to be below minus 120. I said,
No, it's minus 80. Minus 80 is the rule. But if you don't have that document, you have ground zero to stand in. And we can talk about later, if we have time, about what you need to do when you're dealing with a spectrum analyzer, but be sure that you hang on to that document because it's very worthwhile if you start running into issues with
what the cell carriers use to measure and what you use to measure and what's actually required to measure can be 3 different things.
And I can guarantee you that 9 out of 10 cases with the cellular company is they're not measuring it properly.
That's
and I
right.
hate to say this with the engineers in this room, it's probably half of us aren't measuring it properly. And it's very easy to make mistakes and overload the front end of your receiver. So
very easy on
keep
a
the
spectrum.
document.
The schedule of maintenance, there's actually a line in the rule that, and I forget what the exact wording of says, but it says you should have a schedule of maintenance. And I asked the commission one day, I said, I don't really know of any engineer that has a schedule of when he's going to do maintenance. Well, in discussion, we found out that really They want to just make sure that you are visiting your transmitter site, you're inspecting it on regular intervals. Another place in the rule it says, as often as necessary to assure compliance. And in one of our classes one day, somebody asked me, said, what does that mean? I said, well, that means you don't ever have to go to the transmitter if you don't want to, but woe be unto you should the inspector come into town and go to your transmitter, find something out of range, and the first question will be, well, when was the last time you checked this? So if you keep a maintenance log, and it doesn't matter how you do it, I use at my stations, I always just use like a 25-cent spiral bound book from Walmart, and every time you visit the transmitter sites, you just make a note in there of what you did or what you observed. The commission loves documentation, so if they walk in and see that, they know that you've been visiting the transmitter. Another question that comes up in our classes is, how often should you visit the transmitter? My rule of thumb has always been once a week. Things can happen from week to week. So if you don't go out there, I went to one time, I think I shared this with you, and I always ride with the engineer because I'd rather go in his car and get stuck than get in mine or whatever. Yeah. So we go out and we pulled off this road, off a paved road, and went across this field, and there was no tracks where anybody had been going out there. So we went through the field, and then we went in these woods, and there was no path. We were dodging trees and bushes and everything. I said, where are we going? You know, it doesn't look like I haven't been out there since Tarzan lived in one of the trees. We finally go around this clump of trees. He said, okay. I said, where are we? We're at the transmitter. All I could see was just a bunch of bushes. Then I saw something sticking up through the bushes, and that was this tower. I said, oh, man. You couldn't even see the building because of growth. We go in, and I lie not. He opened, once he got the door open, we went in. I could not read the meters on the transmitter until I scraped off the cobwebs. That's how bad it was. So you got to visit your transmitter. So that's what that schedule of maintenance happens to be. John's got one here.
Yeah, this is just a log I use for a station I do some work for. It happens to be a BE5C solid state transmitter. Got all the pertinent information. I've got the TPO, the ERP, the overall efficiency at TPO, and then forward power, what's actual, reflected. Inlet temperature is always important, and outlet, that way I know the room temperatures are okay, voltage. And then I'm guilty as anybody. I don't always fill out the module readings. I do those about once a month, but I set up so I could look at the modules and see if there's anything. Exciter readings. Here's at the bottom, frequency check, because hey, you're supposed to check frequency on a regular basis. Doesn't say how often, but I try to do it a couple times a year. Tower light check, that's what I do for my quarterly tower light inspection. I'll make a note there. Remote control, calibration, transmitter operation, any other notes, and then I date it and sign it. So that I keep those in a notebook, and I go to the site, try to go weekly. If worst case, it might be every 2 weeks, but normally it's weekly. And it's just a great tool to use if you're trying to show a maintenance log and then keep up with the parameters and what's going on at your particular site. So
another really neat thing about a maintenance log, when you get as old as I am, and John, and we'll add Frank in there too, because he's still got his hair. We've lost ours. Yeah. We go to the same barber. But if you work at a station a long time and you do the maintenance logs, it really comes in handy because you may have a problem occur and you say, you know, we had that same problem 2 or 3 years ago. What did we do to fix it? Well, you can go back in the old maintenance log and say, that's what I remember that. Yeah. That's what we did. So it's good like that.
And it doesn't have to be anything like this. At another site, I just have a spiral notebook. I go by there every week because their EAS equipment is at their transmitter site. So while I sit down, I look at the transmitter, I look at their, they have an AM and a translator. I look at both of those, and I just put a note that the readings are normal, which they usually are, and check a couple other parameters and go on my merry way. So at least there's a maintenance log right there.
The great thing about that, you can catch problems that creep up on you gradually.
Oh yeah,
that's correct.
That's
it. Reflective power's gone up 5 watts.
Yeah.
Past 3 or 4 months.
Sure.
That's exactly right, and that's where that comes in really handy.
Yeah.
And every transmitter's different. you know, depending on what brand you have, any more of the parameters. And a lot of the newer transmitters, I think Gates Air and Altel both, will allow you to do data dumps, so you can dump this once a week or however often and keep a running tally. So it's a lot easier to do now than it used to be.
The only situation is there is no actual rule, as far as I can find, that says you have to have a maintenance log. But that will suffice for the schedule of maintenance. There is a rule for the schedule of maintenance, and if you keep a maintenance log, that's, even though it's not written out, you must have a maintenance log at the transmitter. That will cover you on the schedule of maintenance and all.
Yes, sir.
Years ago, I remember we used to have frequency or deviation monitors in the rack.
Yeah.
It would show you if you're high or low. And then there was services, external services, that would measure your frequency and send you, every month, it would send you a form. Well, I don't see anything like that, and most stations don't have any kind of frequency monitor. So I guess my question is, if you're going to measure frequency, what's acceptable? Can you use an MFJ frequency counter for that? Or do you have to use some kind of type accepted, you know, I mean, that's been a question in my mind.
Well, you know, if I'm going out, you'll laugh. My favorite frequency counter, and I have a couple of them in my shop, is an old Heath kit that I've had from years ago, and it just works wonderfully.
You can calibrate it with WWV.
That's right. That's exactly right. You know, a new bench type frequency counter will cost you anywhere from $300 to $400. I saw an engineer the other day had a handheld that he spent a couple $100 for and did a really good job of it. So I think you just have to look at the specs and have a device, and you could share it among stations. If you do contract work, you can carry it around and check all the stations. Just remember, maybe every July you check all your contract stations, or you run around to all your sites, and then again in January you do the same thing. But you know, none of those devices that we had in the old days were any more accurate, and probably a lot less accurate than an inexpensive frequency counter is today, because they had to be calibrated on a regular basis, so they'd lose their calibration. So I would just say find a good bench type frequency counter and utilize that. I mean, I actually have one site that has a frequency, well, it did have a frequency counter. It sat on the transmitter for years until it went poof one day. So that was the end of it, and I got to replace it. Any other questions?
Another thing we always look at is make sure that you got the RF hazard signs, and we'll talk about that more this afternoon, but you have to have those posted around the tower. There are different levels of hazard signs depending upon the intensity of the RF, and we'll
and multilingual is a good thing to have now too.
This is something some people, and when you're inspecting a tower, you can look at it and see if they have recently painted it or they're fixing to paint it. The FAA rules now stipulate that if you have any kind of conduit or any kind of a coax that's on the outside of the tower, not inside, then they actually, when they paint the tower, the banding, you have to paint the coax to match the banding. So change from red to white and as it goes up. That's because of airline or pilots, so that if you get too many lines on a tower, it might be hard for them to distinguish that there's a red and white. He mentioned this a while ago, especially in FM, I think in AM as well, but you need to know what the efficiency of your transmitter is. Typically, when I go into an FM station, and we'll look at it this afternoon, you use the efficiency. You use the plate voltage times the plate current times the efficiency. I'll take out my trusty calculator on my phone. Yeah. First thing I'll do when I walk in is I'll do that, and then I'll show it to the engineer. This is what it says your transmitter is putting out. Where do you find this? Typically, the best place to find it is on the checkout sheet that came with the transmitter. Now, obviously, that's probably been lost for 10 years. They don't know where that is. So you have to have some way to know what the efficiency of your transmitter is to be able to. You can actually go in the book, the manual, and it will give you sort of a simulated efficiency curve based on your frequency and your power.
The new transmitters some of the newer models will actually provide the
Right,
efficiency
they
for
do.
you. If you go back and you have an older tube type transmitter or an older solid state and you don't have that information, if you contact the manufacturer and you know who purchased the transmitter, then they can find that information and actually give you a copy of all the original parameters during the test. And I've done that for the stations that I do work for because
BEAM, that's the only way that you're gonna get
yeah,
that.
that's exactly right. It's a really handy thing to have. So
Typically what the commission will tell you, and I remember when I started doing inspections and I went over to Atlanta, I went through the stuff with them over there, they will not allow you, and this is sort of a written rule, they will not allow you to use the power meter or the output meter on the transmitter for two reasons. One, typically the meter reads in percentage, so who knows what that is. And secondly, just about all of them have a calibration control that they can go in and calibrate what you want it to read. I was at one of Wendell stations one time at APT, and the engineer there had the GUI up on the screen, and we were looking at the power, and he said, well, let me calibrate this. So he just had the power going. You could move that meter anywhere you wanted. He said, I'm going to set that at 100% because we just read it on the power meter. So you can make it read anywhere you go. I shared with John the other day that I heard a story of where they went in, an inspector went in and looked at a transmitter, and this happened to be a transmitter that was actually co-located with the studio, and it was reading 100%. And he looked at the plate voltage and plate current, this was an FM, and right quick like, just in his mental calculations, he said, there's no way this transmitter can be putting out 100%. There must be something wrong with the meter. So they tapped on the meter to see if it was stuck, and it didn't move. So the engineer, not the inspector, but the engineer actually turned the transmitter off. The meter stayed at 100%. He said, now what is the deal here? So it was one of the transmitters you've seen them where you can hinge up the meter bridge, and he hinged up the meter bridge, and the wire, the monitor wire coming out of the transmitter was disconnected, and there was another wire hooked to it, a pair of wires. They traced it out, and it went through a hole in the top of the transmitter over into the rack, down into the bottom of the rack, and there was a little box down there. He opened up the box, and there was a 9-volt battery and a potentiometer. The deal was the transmitter was sitting at the studio behind a glass window right in between the general manager's office and the restroom. So the general manager was walking up and down, and he would like to see his transmitter run at 100%. So who knew what the transmitter was running? But they had it set to read 100%. So that's where that comes in.
Another thing why efficiency factor is really important is, I know most of you probably have sites that have watt meters. But, you know, over the years, elements fail, meters fail, and you just order another meter and it doesn't match up with the line section. You can't really depend on those watt meters for 100 absolutely % sure that it's accurate unless you're doing a kilometer with it and it's professionally calibrated. Now, television, we'll talk about that later, because they have a way of doing that, but radio does not unless you really have a load and set it up. So the efficiency factor becomes very critical in determining power, not necessarily what the output meter is reading and what the watt meter is reading.
I've seen
So.
watt meters vary wildly.
Oh, yeah.
Depending on where in the line they were and how much reflected power.
Yeah, I think the percentage of accuracy is maybe 5 to 8%. Well, think about how much 5 to 8% can be in the overall operation of your station. So,
if you have a problem with a inline section, and you send it back, you have to send the meter and the inline section.
Yeah, and the cable.
And the cable, because it's calibrated. Even the ones the television stations use, the Enrich use, you actually calibrate it with its cable.
Yeah.
You feed it back on itself to calibrate it before you hook it to the transmission line.
The meter right over here, the delta meter, there are two parts. We'll talk about that later. When you have one of those fail and you have to send it back to Delta for calibration, there's a cable that goes with it that's actually in the box. You have to send the whole set back or you will not have an accurate calibration. So it's something to remember if, you know, when you're
on the regular
working on
bird
something.
watt meters that have a slug up in the section and all, if you replace that slug, then your readings are no longer. I had one go bad one time, and I just ordered a new slug from Bird. When it came in, they had stamped on the invoice, did not guarantee calibration,
Yeah.
because I didn't send the whole thing back. So,
Yep.
any questions about the public file or things that you look for in documents and stuff like that? We're going to talk about this afternoon EAS and some other technical stuff that we need to look at. I tell you what we can actually do, which I think would be good, because we're, instead of getting into EAS already, it's